5 years ago, what were you doing? April 22. Does anyone remember? Maybe it's a little bit foggy. I can tell you probably what you were doing. You were in your home because we were under the most strict lockdown in the country at this moment on this day 5 years ago exactly. This was the lockdown where Governor Whitmer prevented us from traveling to a second residency. We couldn't go to church. All the schools were closed. You remember this period, right? Yes. I know a lot of people don't want to remember this, but as Joe said in the introduction, we have to, because this was a major infringement on civil rights. And if our civil rights don't work in emergencies, what good are they? We'll soon find ourselves with a continuous stream of emergencies. And so this is very important to me, and sometimes I feel like I'm the only person who cares about this because we don't hear about this issue from the media. We don't hear about this issue from many politicians. I know the Trump administration is bringing this back up again and wants to do more of a reckoning on lockdowns and what happened. But one of my major takeaways, one of the major lessons for today that I want to convey to you is it's really up to us to hold our officials accountable for what they did during lockdowns. And as sometimes I feel like I'm a bit just resigned to the fact that we're not going to deal with this issue anytime soon, because I think that politicians who created these orders, the public health officials who guided them and recommended these lockdowns, they're not going to want to revisit these anytime soon because they're going to make them look bad. And so we'll probably have to wait for decades, maybe, for those people to retire before we can really take a good look at what happened and make sure it doesn't happen again. So I was very pleasantly surprised when just a couple weeks ago, I was in my car driving home from soccer practice, and I turned on NPR, which I do very often. I like to listen to NPR. Not to get news about what is happening in the world. That's not really what NPR does. What they do, though, is they provide an insight into the mindset and the narratives that our elites typically are thinking about and concerned with. So I view it as a little bit of a covert intelligence operation that I'm on. And anyway, I'm listening to NPR, and I hear the announcer or the interviewer say this, and I went and got the transcript so I could repeat it exactly. This is what I heard. And so if we go back to where we started this conversation about trade-offs, before the pandemic, you thoroughly described this scientific view that these kinds of interventions we've been talking about the whole time, the lockdown approach, was difficult to implement and would come with heavy costs and uncertain benefits. And yet, the United States and dozens of other countries plowed ahead with the shutdown and lockdown approaches anyway, focusing on their theoretical life-saving benefits. 5 years later, what your findings show is that the state-by-state data within the U.S. hasn't definitely established those life-saving benefits, but we do know a lot about the costs. That was an NPR interview with two authors of a book that was just published, that I just got, in COVID's wake. And the reason this book is important is because these two professors teach at Princeton. And Princeton is the belly of the beast when it comes to elite progressivism, right? So is the tide turning? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we will get a COVID reckoning sooner than I thought. Because even at Princeton, they're allowed now to question the lockdowns. So that's a hopeful note to start. I want to make sure, just to focus this talk a little bit, this is about lessons that we can learn, that we should learn as citizens, as voters. This is not about what public health officials or what governors should do during a pandemic. We know lots about what they should do. We've studied it. And we just went through it. We learned lots of lessons about what not to do through our last pandemic response. And I've already written all of these rules. They're pretty simple. I know they might be difficult to read there, but they're things like use the normal lawmaking process, don't divide society into essential and non-essential. If you're going to restrict civil rights, it must be temporary and transparent. Make the policies easy to understand. Use a consistent source of legal authority, these sorts of things. What I want to talk about today is what we need to learn from our lockdown experience instead. Does anyone recognize these photos, these images? The one on the right is from Wuhan, I think, in February of 2020, probably. The one on the left is Italy. I show these because the number one lesson that I want to have you take away is that we tend to overreact to pandemics. Okay, that is our tendency. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was a sense that we would maybe make an error and not respond strong enough or be strict enough about it. We actually, as humans, we have a tendency in exactly the opposite direction. And I think these images show that, right? This was a respiratory disease similar to the flu, and we immediately went to these types of actions, right? We overreacted very quickly. And there's lots of incentives in place for people to overreact. We saw our expert institutions overreact. The World Health Organization overreact. They irresponsibly published estimates on the infection mortality rate that were way off by orders of magnitude. The Imperial College in London did modeling and predicted that 2 million people in the US would die in the first few months, right? It wasn't even close. So we have this tendency. The media obviously has an incentive to overreact as well. Fear sells clicks, right? We know this. People pay attention when they feel like they're threatened. And so the media has this incentive. And our politicians have an incentive in some ways to overreact, right? They want to get in front of the parade and do something about it and take charge and get credit for whatever success might come of it. So that's our first lesson. Our second one is that these things are important and we need to use them. If you can't see them, these are all pandemic plans that, different pandemic plans that Michigan has produced over the years. The problem is that I want to do a quick reenactment of what maybe a Whitmer administration official did with the plans that they had in place that the state had made in 2020 before the pandemic. That's what they did with them. Just tossed them aside, and this is one of the reasons why the lockdowns in Michigan in particular were so disastrous, is because the Whitmer administration was trying to make up all these rules on the fly. Right? I mean, it's very difficult to do that if you think about the undertaking of trying to create rules for 10 million people that regulate all of our interactions in public. It's very difficult. And the Whitmer administration took that on anyway, and that's why so many of the rules and mandates were confusing and contradictory, and it allowed them to do things that they shouldn't have done, which were excessive violations of our civil rights. Plans are useful not just for an ordered response, but they really should be embraced by politicians and by public health officials. Because imagine if Governor Whitmer went before us in March of 2020, and instead of trying to convince us that this pandemic was very serious and we needed to be very afraid, if she came before us and said, I have a plan, we have an emergency, but we've made a plan already, I'm going to execute this plan, right? It would be a much different approach. She could even say that this plan was created by a bipartisan group of individuals. It was public health experts. It aligns with the World Health Organization, the CDC. Some of the people who made this plan were from the previous administration, the Snyder administration. She could have done all of that. And really, if she's just executing the plan, she's not politically responsible for the results of that plan, right? This plan was made by someone else. She's obligated to execute it. That would have been a much better approach. In fact, that's the approach that the state wants to, that they had previously planned to do. In fact, these plans up here do not call for lockdowns or anything like that. They don't call for the governor to take charge of everything and issue emergency orders that apply to the whole state. These plans actually are set up so that local public health districts and officials will run the show, basically. They'll make the decisions, and the state really does more of just a coordination and supporting service. So it's very different from what we actually got. And we need to find a way, though, to make sure that when the emergency strikes, they don't just throw them aside and that the plan actually gets executed. The third lesson. Sorry. It can happen again tomorrow. I went through and looked in the entirety of Michigan statutes for where the law gives to a bureaucrat or the governor or some other public official the ability to declare an emergency and grant themselves unilateral control over something. There's more than 30 instances in Michigan law right now where bureaucrats or the governor could do that. And they can do it for virtually anything. Let me show you. These are some of what I call the triggers that would allow them to grant themselves emergency powers. Potential to harm human health, imminent danger to public health, imminent risk of injury to public health. None of these terms are defined in the law, so the officials get to define them however they want. Extraordinary emergency, a threat to public safety and health. These are things that can be used to trigger emergency powers. And there's significant leeway and discretion given in at least two major laws. This is the Public Health Code, and this is what Governor Whitmer turned to after the lawsuit that we brought against her was successful and the Supreme Court overturned her emergency powers. She just switched to this law, which, as you can see, is very nondescript and uses broadly worded generic language. The director can control an epidemic if she determines it's necessary to protect the public health. None of those terms are defined. Last time, what the state health director did was she defined gathering. Then if she declares this emergency, she can prohibit the gathering of people for any purpose and establish procedures to ensure continuation of essential public health services and enforcement of health laws. Last time, what the state health director did is she defined a gathering as any time two people meet in public. So like incidentally, if you met at a gas station with the person next to you at the pump, that is, according to her, a gathering. And that allowed her to regulate everything, right? So it allowed her to say you had to wear masks and allowed her to say businesses could only be at 50% capacity, and it allowed her to say bowling alleys couldn't be open. All that stuff was done under this law, which is really about something different. It doesn't actually contemplate shutting down most of society. And I can assure you that the legislators who passed this law in 1978 had no intentions of it being used the way that it was in 2020, right? So, our law is filled with this kind of language that's very broadly worded and could be used in a variety of ways, including issuing lockdowns. This is another dangerous law. This is the Michigan Occupational Safety and Health Act. This is what empowers MIOSHA, which is, I know for a lot of employers, is sort of like a curse word. This has also broadly worded emergency powers for that department. They have to provide safe and healthful work environments free of recognized hazards. And the place of employment has to be free from these recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause serious physical harm to the employee. This is the language that department used during COVID to issue emergency orders and require employers to screen their employees every day, get them tested, make them stay at home if they had symptoms, and all these other sorts of things. require them to wear masks, social distancing, all this was done under this law. So we need to change these laws, and until we do, a governor or a state bureaucrat, literally with a stroke of a pen, can put us into a type of lockdown again. The fourth lesson and last one is that our internal controls are insufficient. And by internal controls, I'm referencing James Madison in the Federalist Paper 51, where he writes, "If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal control on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself." Whenever I read the founders, I weep a little bit for our political discourse in this country, because they were so elegant and wise, and it's such a, it's so very different from what we hear today out of our politicians. But these internal controls, this is the idea that we have a balance of power, checks and balances, separation of powers. Let's run through the lockdown timeline real quick, and I'll demonstrate why our separation of powers don't work that well. Governor Whitmer issued the first emergency order on March 10, 2020. 50 days later, she extended that emergency on April 30 indefinitely, and declared that her new powers were not just about responding to the pandemic and the health threat that it represented, but instead her new powers were going to be used to make sure that the fiscal and economic harms of the pandemic had been solved or improved. I forget the exact term that she used. Then 5 months later, after that, the Supreme Court ruled, as a result of our lawsuit, that the law that the governor used on March 10 was unconstitutional, and that the law that she used on April 30, she used it illegally. So it took 7 months for our internal controls to finally clip the wings of the governor, who was acting unconstitutionally and illegally and violating our civil rights for weeks and months at a time. All right? So we need to have much better internal controls and ones that actually perform. Unfortunately, the Michigan Supreme Court has had an opportunity to respond to or to make a judgment about these emergency powers and the use of and lockdowns, but just last year they punted on the question. They declared a case to be moot, and they said they don't have to make a decision about whether these powers are constitutional anymore because it's unlikely to happen again. And I find it hard to believe that they're unfamiliar with all the language that we just read through, because they're the justices on the Supreme Court. But I hope they're right. I hope that we don't go through this again anytime soon. And I hope they have a very good crystal ball. But again, one of the main takeaway from this is what this tells us is that the system that we have is not going to automatically protect us, right? It's going to be up to us. We have to demand of policymakers that they make changes to the law and that they protect us from these kinds of situations again. We have to make sure that they are required to execute a plan that was designed with cool heads and in consultation with a large group of people, instead of the kind of unilateral fly by the seat of our pants kind of response that we got from Governor Whitmer during 2020 and 2021. So please hold your elected officials accountable. Talk to them about this. Tell them that we need to make these changes. We need to put protections on our emergency powers in this state, and we need to make sure that this kind of lockdown doesn't happen again. Thank you.
I promised some really tough questions for Mike, and I think Holly is bringing them.
Anybody have any cards? I'll collect them.
Do you want the questions limited to this topic, or?
Oh, you know what? Let's put Mike to the test. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. One questioner wants everybody to know about the book, The Real Dr. Fauci. Mike, do you have a comment on that book?
I have not read it. That's the RFK book, right? That's what he wrote, yeah. I haven't read it yet. I've heard good things about it. I'm surprised that Dr. Fauci hasn't come up with some alternative evidence to what RFK says in that book, but to my knowledge, he hasn't.
Mike, have you been able to make any sense of some of the mandates that seem silly? In fact, I'm thinking of some of the ones that the Mackinac Center made fun of. We actually had a cartoonist draw cartoons of things like you could be in a rowboat. You can't be in a rowboat, but you could be in a kayak. And there were others like that. And so, but set aside the goofiness for a minute, or apparent goofiness. Sometimes there's a good reason for something that seems goofy. Do you have a comment?
All I can say about a lot of those very strange mandates that we had, those happened during the lockdown that was occurring right on this day, on April 22nd. This is when the governor she turned up the dial a little bit, and I was tracking, the data on what we were seeing from the pandemic during that time period, and I think what was happening was the daily deaths were continuing to rise, and the governor was just feeling like she needed to continue to do more and more to try to get those numbers to start to come down. She didn't realize, or I don't know if she thought about this, but the death rate is actually a lagging indicator because the infections are happening before that, and it takes about 14 days for people to start to experience symptoms and to and have reactions. So that's actually a lagging indicator, and she was putting these stricter things in place while the infection rate was actually falling, and things were actually getting better. But because she saw the daily rates of deaths go up, I think she felt like she needed to crank it up. Where these particular things came from, I don't know. I think this is a result of trying to make it up on the fly. And suddenly she had to think about, well, do we allow motorboats and not kayaks, or what's the difference? And I think later they came up with some rationales for some of these, but they weren't very good rationales, to be honest. And one of the things that I did is I went back and looked at exactly when these different things were put in place. Like particularly golfing was very interesting because for a while golfing was totally prohibited. You could only walk on a golf course. And so we had our cartoonist actually draw a picture of a person walking with a club that looked like a golf club. That was allowed, but not walking with a golf club, which is what you do when you golf. And then she changed and allowed golf, but without golf carts. And then you could have golf carts, but you could only have 2 different households represented in the golf cart. I went back and looked at some of the communications that the governor had during that time period, and she was getting communications from the Golf Association, Michigan Golf Association, that were telling her things like, golf is safe, we're outside, you can use carts, all these things. And so I think that's how it happened, is she took the advice from this golf association and gradually kind of allowed for more and more of this kind of activity. And I suspect that's how some of these other things happened too, is there was some special interest group who was able to get the ear of the governor and get a special exemption or a special recognition for their particular activity.
Mike, why did it take 7 months for the Supreme Court to rule on our lawsuit?
It's a great question. One of the things that we know about emergencies, and particularly public health emergencies, is that the courts are very hesitant to overrule an active emergency order. They think that they should just give the discretion to the public health officials and to the elected officials, and they don't want to overturn those. It's just kind of a tradition in law. So we already know that. So that's part of it, in that they didn't want to actively confront and overturn this emergency order. And judges typically say things like, well, we're not health experts, we're not medical experts, so we should allow the medical experts to make these kinds of decisions. Of course, what we're not saying in that is these aren't just medical decisions, right? These are ethical decisions, right? When you lock down half of society or prevent people from leaving their homes under threat of penalty of law, that's not just about medical health, right? It's a much bigger issue, and so I think the courts should take these issues up sooner, and not just allow the discretion to fall to the public health officials. The one thing that's really disappointing about what the Michigan Supreme Court has done recently on this, and I mentioned that they've punted on making a decision about the use of these emergency powers. What that means is the next time we have a pandemic and we have any kind of pandemic response, we're going to have a legal controversy again, right? Because we have these broadly worded laws that on their face are unconstitutional because they give so much power to the executive branch. So when the next pandemic hits, we're going to have lawsuits and we're going to have legal controversy, and people aren't going to know what is what and what's right and who's correct. And instead, what the Supreme Court should do is make a ruling now so that when the next pandemic hits, if it does, we won't have that legal controversy. We'll avoid it. And a lot of states actually have done that. They've made that improvement since the pandemic. They've changed their laws and made it clearer exactly what the chain of authority is going to be and what kinds of responses they're going to have. Michigan hasn't done that yet, and we desperately need to. Oh, other states that have, I know Pennsylvania actually passed a constitutional amendment that limits the power of their governor to issue emergency orders that last for more than a few weeks, I think. But a lot of the Republican-led states made changes to their laws that made it clearer, restricted, put time limits on how long these powers can last, and those sorts of things.
Mike, you reviewed all of the emergency power provisions in state law, and you found 30 some odd. Do the provisions of any of them provide consequences for overstepping the bounds of the law?
That is a great question. I don't think so. I don't think there are any that provide a penalty to the public official who might abuse them. That's not in there. I mean, our system is set up really that the courts are going to make that determination. But as I said, the courts are really slow. So it's not a great mechanism. And that's a great idea. Maybe that should be included in these emergency power laws. A couple of years ago, I worked with the legislature in drafting 30 different bills that would have added these kinds of protections and restrictions to these emergency powers. They did get a hearing in a committee, but they died after that, didn't go any further. But we have all that work done, and so we really just need a legislature and governor who's interested in protecting our civil rights during emergencies.
Related question, how often were people actually disciplined? Oh, I'm sorry, I misread it. How often were people actually disciplined for breaking the emergency order? So not the people trying to enforce the orders, but the citizens themselves. The questioner adds a comment, I know businesses were more at risk than individuals, but do you have data on how many business owners were fined, arrested versus individuals?
I don't have information on businesses versus individuals, but absolutely correct that businesses were mostly the ones who were targeted with fines and those sorts of things. And that was mostly MIOSHA who was doing that under their emergency powers. So I think I remember them publishing, and this was sort of wild and bizarre too, MIOSHA and the state government was publishing the names of the businesses they were fining, which is not normal practice. So they were trying to expose these businesses and give them a bad name and give them a bad reputation. And I remember seeing about 150 or so businesses. But we should remember, and that's a great question, because the lockdowns don't work in part because they're impossible to enforce, right? The state does not have a large enough executive operation or police agency to actually monitor all of this activity during a lockdown, right? So there weren't many individuals who were fined and penalized and those sorts of things. And your experience really varied by the place where you lived. I knew people who lived up northern Michigan who, they'd tell you nothing really happened during 2020. We didn't even see anything different. People didn't change their behavior much, and no one was enforcing it, and they kind of just let it be. My brother-in-law lives in northern Minnesota, and he said, people didn't even talk about it hardly. It was just such a small thing for them. So it really matters on what your local community was doing, and that's really what made the variation in how the pandemic was treated in different areas.
Mike, there is speculation that these onerous transgression of our liberties were a test to determine how much government could get away with without a revolution. Would you comment? Do you have a comment on that?
Well, I don't know if it was a test. Following how this happened, I think it's pretty unlikely that it could be something like that, but it definitely was a test for me, because I was surprised by how quickly it seemed like people gave up these rights. Right? I mean, I thought it would never be possible for the government to prohibit us from gathering at a church and worshiping on Sunday. Right? But we did that. In some states, not so much in Michigan, some states, they actively enforced that. Police went to churches and gave people tickets for worshiping, for being there. Right? I never thought that was possible. So in a real sense, it was a big test of us. And I think some of these lessons, like the first one, we need to remember, we tested that, and we do tend to overreact. And so we need to keep that in mind and create systems that don't empower that, but that actually tamp that down and control our tendency to overreact.
Mike, a couple questioners have just added some personal things that happened to them. One person suffered the death of a longtime friend, and it's related to the governor preventing hospitals from prescribing certain medications. I'm having trouble reading some of it, but COVID help, like ivermectin and so forth. Yeah.
There's all kinds of tragedies from this episode. A lot of them are because of this real disease, but a lot of them are also from the lockdowns. And I think, the book here from the Princeton professors is, I've just started reading it, but it's In COVID's Wake is the title. And so they very much are trying to dig at and record and make sure that we take full accounting of all of those tragedies, not just the one from the pandemic, but the ones from our reaction to it. And there's so many. And again, like I said, I was shocked at how we restricted individual rights, but also I was shocked by how the medical community allowed for this kind of, focus, obsession with one disease at the expense of like all the other health issues that we commonly have, and including things like being willing to restrict people's ability to go see their loved ones when they're in facilities, or restricting people's ability to get medical procedures if someone thinks they're non-essential. All of these things, or how about, we know this had a very real impact. Very few people didn't go to the doctor nearly as often. They didn't get screened for cancer and these other sorts of things, which we know are very important. And so we've had more serious health outcomes as a result of those kinds of policies. And so we need to take a full accounting of all that, all the tragedy that we had to go through.
So Mike, can you comment a little bit about the damage to trust in the medical community in general? The questioner asks, why would anyone trust the medical community given another health emergency? The doctors were penalized for using their discretion on the one side, and on the other side, they were clueless.
Yeah, I think that is a major, major problem, and maybe one of the largest ramifications from this whole episode is that the damage done to public health. It is something, public health, the reputation of public health is something that is built over a very long time period, but it can be destroyed in an instant. And I think that COVID definitely took a large chunk of it, because it was obvious. We knew, so lots of people could see that the kinds of things that they were recommending, they didn't really have good evidence for the things that they were recommending. They just really wanted them to work, right? And they just kept with it. And because it was politicized, I think, it prevented them from being able to admit that they were wrong about things, because that damages their political reputation. And so we were stuck in this world where we were getting advice and mandates on what to do, which we knew were clearly not going to work. And then we had to pretend like they were. And they had to pretend like they were going to, when they probably knew they weren't. There's some Solzhenitsyn phrase here that I should use about lying and something. But that's kind of the experience we were in. And I hope they can rebuild trust, but it's very difficult, and it takes a long time to rebuild it. And I hope they've learned this lesson. I'm not sure. I haven't seen any signs yet that they have. Maybe, I know the Trump administration has new leaders in federal health agencies. Good luck to them. But I think it's a tall task.
Mike, one questioner says, MIOSHA threatened to shut down the company I work for, one of us here, over a gallon of Windex. And you mentioned that the state had published a list, you saw 150 or so names of businesses on there, of businesses they had fined or penalized. To what extent do you think that it made businesses vulnerable to bad actors? Sometimes there are union disputes in companies, and could a bad actor have called in some anonymous complaint and ended up putting a business on the blacklist?
And didn't necessarily have to be a bad actor. I think a lot of the cases where businesses were fined, ones I went in and looked at kind of the details of what happened, most of the time it was an employee of the business who ratted out the business because people weren't wearing masks properly enough, or they weren't distancing, or they didn't like something or other. So most of the time that is what happened. It wasn't, and this again is a big fiction of lockdowns, that they can be actively enforced, right? It wasn't MIOSHA actually going into the businesses and making sure that they were doing all of the things that the governor was requiring them to do. It was only when an employee, an insider there, would report them that MIOSHA even found out about it. But that is how many of those started. I do want to hear the story about the bottle of Windex, though, so afterwards, because that's a good one. I haven't heard that one before.
Okay, now we're to the hard ones, Mike. Mike, you used to be the Mackinac Center's Director of Education Policy. What is the potential for school choice in Michigan? Doesn't it require a constitutional amendment?
Yes, that's true. All those things are true. Actually, I can tie this right into lockdowns and the pandemic, because what we saw, one of the positive things that came out of this is that parents recognized that the things that their children were being taught were not necessarily the things that they wanted their children to be taught. And they also recognized that the quality of the schooling, the curriculum that their children were receiving was maybe not as high a standard as what they would want. And so what we've seen since 2020 is an explosion of school choice. The Wall Street Journal in 2012 declared that year the year of school choice because I think a handful of states had passed school choice laws. Post-COVID, we've just blown that out of the water. Now over half of the states in the US have some form of large school choice program which allows parents to get support to homeschool their student, to enroll them in a private school, to get additional tutoring or therapy or all other sorts of educational type of treatment. And the unfortunate thing is Michigan cannot partake in that because of our Constitution. It has a strict ban on using public funds to support any child being privately educated. And this was passed in 1970.
Now, not just religious schools,
Yeah,
right?
that's right. That's right. Not just religious schools. It includes all what they call non-public schools. So any sort of private, independent school. We passed that in 1970. It was because the MEA, the large teacher unions, and the school associations themselves wanted to prevent this from ever happening, and they had a good vision of the future because this is where public policy was going, to empower parents to allow them to enroll their children in the school of their choice. And they got out ahead of it and put it into the Constitution and banned it. There was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment behind it, and we've been constantly trying to find ways to change that constitutional amendment, but it's very difficult in Michigan to do that. So we've got lots of strategies, and we're working them out.
All right, Mike, we're going to wrap up with a lightning round. I will give you 10 seconds to answer each of the next 3 questions. How well or poorly did the mainstream media cover the Mackinac Center report on corporate subsidy job creation?
Okay, I guess they reported on it, and a lot of people found out about it.
Okay. Remind us how much it will cost to bring back the Palisades nuclear plant, and where will the money come from?
Wow. Someone thought I would know that. I think it's $1 billion.
Yeah, okay, so whoever asked that, contact Jason Hayes at the Mackinac Center. He knows it to the penny. And last questions, you got 10 seconds.
Okay.
Please suggest a good source of economic and political information outside of what the Mackinac Center provides.
A good source of economic. I love all our sister think tanks: Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation, AEI. They're all great. Hillsdale, Northwood. We have lots of friends, so I'm happy to. Any of those are good with me.
What do you read? What news sources do you go to?
Well, I mainly just read Insider Lansing stuff and the Wall Street Journal. That's pretty much it. I'm on a slow news drip now. I like to read magazines. They're actually quite good.
Mike, that was just terrific. Thank you very much.